This is supposed to be a lecture delivered by Dr. Nader El-Bizri, but he cannot make it today, so I'll see what I can make of it. Luckily, we have his slides and his fly sheets. And this is supposed to be an introduction for the course CS 202 and the philosophical background for the course, which, as you can see, is mainly an introduction to some Greek philosophers. And there is a guy, a philosopher, no minor player, Alfred North Whitehead, if you look at the fly sheets, who has made it easy for everyone who wants to introduce Plato. Since he's the first philosopher to be introduced, Whitehead says the safest general characterization of European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Now, you know what a footnote is. Anybody who doesn't? You know, it's not enough to know what a foot is, and the note is to know what a footnote is. Okay, good. So this tells us that the bulk or the corpus, the main text, the main ideas were drafted by Plato, and everyone had a contribution, but it's a contribution which goes around this essential product by Plato. But we're not really concerned with, it's an exaggeration, of course. Not that exaggerations are not useful. It's very useful, as you can see. But we're not concerned with the European philosophical tradition in this course. We are concerned with a different sort of tradition. How different this is a matter of debate. But it's a tradition that you might call medieval, which is more akin to theology than to philosophy, and it will center on the contributions made by prominent Jewish, Christian, and Muslim philosophers. This is not an image of Plato that you have. This is an image of Plato's teacher, Socrates, and this is an image which was drawn earlier on by Plato in a book, Phaedo, but now painted by some guy, Jacques-Louis David, I guess. And you see Socrates at the moment of death, but I want you to mind the finger which is pointing upward. This is the teacher of Socrates, of Plato, who has been using Socrates in his dialogues. Some say as a mouthpiece, but let's say as a main player in the exposition of the points of views of Plato. Again, remember the finger which is pointing upward. To move to another painting, Dr. El-Bizri has a taste for these. This is a fresco which was drawn by Raphael in the beginning of the 16th century, where we were having a Platonist revival, which coincides with the Renaissance, a revival which was taking place throughout Europe, different times, different places. And the center of this fresco is occupied by two figures, Plato on the left and Aristotle. I'll be saying a bit about these later on, but this has many other figures which mostly are the product of the Greco-Roman era. Of course, you might see a guy with a turban to the left, lower left, and this is Ibn Rushd, but most of these figures are from the Greco-Roman so-called pagan civilization. And Raphael has this impact, or leaves this impact, where you see these guys moving forward towards you. Now, if you're there in person, in the place where you have this fresco, and you turn your back, you will see this other fresco, another painting. And you tend to have an impression that people are moving away from you. So it's as if you're sitting in the middle of a journey which is moving towards this painting. And this painting goes upward. Now, if you remember if I go back a bit, you would also see Plato in the middle with his finger pointing upwards, right? But we don't know what is upwards. In this another fresco by Raphael, you see that what is upward is the heavens, with Jesus occupying center stage. But the guy who's painting upwards is Saint Justin, a Christian martyr, who was very crucial in developing a certain understanding of the Trinity, which proved to be very crucial for later Catholicism. Saint Justin was a Platonist. And what we're trying to see is to understand some of the ideas of Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus, and to see their impact on the later thought among the Christians and the Muslims in particular. Plato was also received by the Muslim philosophers and theologians, and you have here also some other paintings. On the left, you see Socrates portrayed as a Muslim saint, perhaps a Sufi. It says, كان قليل الأكل والشرب شديد التعبد يكثر ذكر الموت etc. مات بالصم, which is what you see in the first painting. And on the right you see Aristotle, again with this halo around him as a saint, teaching Alexander. Your impression of Alexander might be taken from the late movie, but this impression, this painter's impression might have been taken from an understanding of Alexander which identifies him perhaps with Dhul Qarnayn mentioned in the Quran. So it's a saint teaching another saintly figure. This is another image of Aristotle. The finger is pointing upward, but not that much. The second hand has a tool. It says بيده آلة النجوم والصناعات. Again, what's mentioned earlier on portrays him as a saintly figure, معتدل في الملابس والمآكل, etc. And in his hand there is a tool, which gives us an impression of Aristotle being an empirical person. And this is a very interesting understanding. To go back to Plato, Plato presides over a very powerful and interesting philosophical tradition which debated the nature of reality, the reality of reality, if you want. And as people went into different directions, like you have a tradition inaugurated or perhaps presided over by Parmenides, which thinks of reality as static, which denies the possibility of change, whereas another tradition, represented here by Heraclitus, thinks of reality as dynamic, as having no center around which this change takes place. Now, Plato's role was to reconcile these two different understandings of nature, and in a sense, satisfying both traditions by admitting an aspect or a part of reality being static and another being in continuous flux. This is crucial for what we're going to say, but the more crucial distinction is that between reality and appearances. So the solution which Plato comes up with says that reality, what is really real, is static, is immutable, whereas what is changing, and we see this change, so there is no point in denying it, is real insofar as it is appearance. So it does not, he thinks of it as a lower level of reality, but if you want to take a radical interpretation, it wouldn't be real at all. And perhaps you've started discussing these in your classes. This is, as Nader El-Bizri would say, an artist's impression of Plato's simile of the cave. If you haven't read it in class, you might know something about it. So there are different layers of reality. We have the people who are just sitting there in the darkness, exposed to shadows produced by these puppeteers on the top. And because the fire is in between, what these people sitting there in the corner could see is the shadows produced by these images. This is their reality. This concludes the whole of reality for them. Others have advanced outside of the cave, or actually inside of the cave, but still haven't made all the way out. And you have the lucky few who have managed to get out of the cave. This is an ascension which has its connotations in terms of our understanding of reality, but also in terms of our understanding of knowledge, of how we know. So there is a journey in terms of knowledge which is paralleled by a certain ascension into knowing the reality of reality. What you behold when you get out of the cave, the real things which are static, immutable, Plato would call the forms. Now, I think we need to make a distinction between two terms, the universal and the form. So you can definitely imagine a form. I mean, my example was the phone. You can imagine a certain entity which is a phone, which every single cellular phone that you might have would be an instance of. But this entity is something which is separate. It applies to all these particular instances. This is the universal. The form is not a universal. You don't need to worry much about the distinction. But to give an example from Plato would be the example about equality. He tends to think of things in this world as changing all the time. So if you say that two rods are equal, then you do not get an impression of what equality is. But you still have this understanding of reality, of equality, which does not relate or pertain to things which are equal. Things which are equal in this world have an enormous degree of variation. But equality itself is not that variable. Other examples that he's well known to give include the perfect circle, which is impossible in this world, or the just state, or an ideal bed, although any bed would be ideal to you now. But the point he's making is that what we grasp in our understanding has a certain reality outside of our minds. Not only this is actually what is properly real, what should be considered real in the proper sense of the word. These are the forms, and to read, the immutable forms or ideas are archetypes that are copied, imitated as models, or standards for mutable. The objects, the forms are captured by reason or understood by reason, whereas everything that we capture by our senses is not a form because it's not that static, it's mutable. And you might have seen that there are several distinctions here. You might call them dualisms. I guess the basic one would be this distinction between reality and appearance, but you have the table: intelligible forms, ideas, sensible things. So forms are things which are captured by the intellect. Being, becoming, the forms are there, that's it. Whereas things of this world actually change. They are always in a process of becoming, immutable, changing, at rest, emotion, eternal, temporal, universals, particulars. I guess another one would be knowledge and illusion. This is a very sharp distinction. And in the tradition that was handed to us, Neoplatonism in particular, these distinctions were made fixed and final. And this is the tradition which was handed over to the Christian and the Muslim theologians we're going to discuss. Another crucial idea from Plato is his understanding of God as a demiurge, or a proper translation would be the artisan or a craftsman, definitely not a craftswoman for Plato. And the demiurge is there to explain the order in the universe. So despite the fact that this world is changing, Plato could see some order in it, and it is the task of the philosopher to make sense of this order. The materials which constitute this world are constituting this world not haphazardly. There is a process, there is some sense to it, and he could make sense of it mathematically, because geometrical understanding or mathematical understanding was thought to be a higher level of understanding according to Plato. Again, this is an issue that I will get back to. So you see that there are the very famous four elements. Again, a very important notion which was taken over by later philosophers: air, water, fire, and earth. But he does not simply understand these elements the way the earlier tradition did. These have a mathematical form, and by virtue of this mathematical form, they come together and they constitute all this variety that we see. To conclude, knowing reality rests on geometry and abstract reasoning. And this is very, very important. Okay, to go back to the fresco by Raphael, again, Plato is shown pointing his finger upward, again, towards these mathematical and abstract entities. And next to Plato, we have Aristotle. Aristotle is pointing somehow outwardly. He's looking at perhaps the finger of Plato, but his hand is pointing somehow downward, towards the sensible things. So to to proceed towards knowledge through these sensible entities rather than by going beyond these sensible entities. Plato is holding a book of his, the Timaeus, again, which mathematizes reality. Moreover, Raphael has drawn Plato on the liking of Leonardo da Vinci, a mathematician by all means, whereas Aristotle is holding his book, Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, and having claimed that ethics cannot be mathematized, cannot be understood in such formal or axiomatic terms. So we have two approaches. Now, these approaches, if you go back to the images which we took from the Islamic tradition, we had an image of Socrates and two images or two paintings of Aristotle, none from Plato, which tells us something, actually, that Plato was not that significant in the Muslim tradition, but only indirectly. Because the Aristotle which was understood or read by this tradition is an Aristotle who was through and through Platonized. And to reconcile Plato and Aristotle more along Platonian lines was a task which was achieved before, was a synthesis which was achieved before Islamic philosophy was inaugurated, but it also continued with some Muslim philosophers. Both seek to grasp universals, but Plato gives universals a whole world on their own, whereas Aristotle thinks of these universals as coming out of the sensible reality we live in. Aristotle's found the universal in the particular as the essence, in answering the question, what is it? And he realized that these sensible things have an essence and have a reality. They are. Whereas if you remember that table, Plato would say that only forms are, they have being. The rest have becoming, so they are not really existent in this sense. A notion that Aristotle would deploy to deal with this mess of ideas is the notion of motion from potentiality to actuality. Because the earlier philosophers, the pre-Socratics, those philosophers that Plato had to reconcile their ideas and to come up with something new, they were concerned with the question of change. And Aristotle believed that change exists, but he gave it a different twist. Change has many different facets, but it's always, or more often, a movement from a potentiality that you have towards a fulfillment or an actuality that it is already latent there. So again, to read, the generation of something, its birth or coming about, embodies a motion from potentiality to actuality as the happening of its form and matter, So the Aristotle's solution to the question of form of change is that there is change, but there is something which subsists throughout change. There is something which is changing. And this something does not disappear in the process. This is something which is actualized. It had a potential, but it is moving towards actuality. You will see hopefully later on how these ideas are relevant. And this idea of change proved very useful because now Aristotle could not only account or prove that there is change, he could account for this change. He has his theory of the four causes, very elaborate, I guess. And these causes explain the movement of something from potentiality to actuality. So you have the material cause. So an example is the wooden table. And in this example, the matter or the material cause would be the wood itself. And if you ask what a table is or what makes a table, wood would be one component of the explanation because it's a material cause. Another component of the explanation is the formal cause. It's the form of that matter. We need to understand the difference between a table and a chair. And this is a table. So it's not just wood. It is wood in a specific form, in a specific design. A third cause would be the agent or the efficient cause, and it is what initiates the change, what causes the change, which is the carpenter. And finally, the teleological cause, which had a lot of theological significance, is the end or the final purpose behind the table. Why do we have a table in the first place? Like making a wooden table to serve dining needs. Another innovation by Aristotle is his categories. In other words, his account for what exists, the furniture of the world. In Arabic, these are translated as al-maqulat, I guess, which is a more faithful translation of the original Greek. So there are things which exist, but some of these things are more primary. And these are called the substances. Remember, I told you something subsists through change. So what subsists, what remains there, what receives the different changes is the substance, or what the Latins have translated as the substance. It is the primary sense in which we refer to a specific thing. But there are things through which we refer to this substance but are not primary, like quality, quantity, relation. So the size of the table does not really matter. It can be a table even if it changes its size, even if it's cut into half. Its color does not really matter, quality. Its position, relation, place, time. All these categories, Aristotle assumes everything that exists falls under one of these categories. And this is a debate which is still alive in modern philosophy. Why 10 categories? But again, this is very crucial for the later philosophers. Finally, in Aristotle, we have a conception of God as unmoved mover. Contrast this to the understanding of God as an artisan or a craftsman in Plato. What will happen later on is that the Muslim and the Christian God will play both roles and more. So the unmoved mover lets nature flow in its causal course by imparting motion on it. So if everything is changing, then you need an original mover. While explaining the causes, you need something which initiates the motion. And the God in Aristotle's conception is an unmoved mover. Finally, we come to Plotinus. So we have a period between Plotinus and Plato, I guess around 600 or 600 years. And in this period, Platonism was consolidated, reconciled with Aristotelianism, and we have a set of final answers, a fixed interpretation of this body of knowledge. And the star of this tradition ultimately is Plotinus. Plotinus, you can imagine in these 600 years the conception of Plato and Aristotle of God, which was quite, interesting, but basically primitive, put forth so many problems concerning the relationship with the world. But it solves certain problems. In both accounts of God, there is a certain material that is being moved in the case of Aristotle, or there is a certain material that the artisan uses to build to make the world out of. And this very interestingly solves or makes the problem of evil a no problem, a non-topic for this philosophy, because there is this original material that the God is using. But in the later traditions, God creates ex nihilo, out of nothing. So where does evil come from? These are issues that will be faced by the later philosophers and the theologians. But in the meantime, Plotinus was also trying to deal with certain issues, and he gives us an understanding of God as the one, as the most perfect, actually the one who is beyond perfection. In Arabic, this would be translated as fawq al-tamam. So the one as ultimate source and causal principle of reality transcends the senses and the world of finite things and human experience. He has nothing to do with this finitude. He generates being, so he is beyond being. And because he is perfect, everything flows out of him, and he's automatically, so to speak. So all beings issue forth from the one as their ultimate origin by necessity. And they are emanated through intermediaries. Now, as people kept thinking on these issues, these intermediaries kept expanding. The list became bigger and bigger. But for Plotinus, it just had a few members enlisted. So we have the one, by necessity, comes out of it the intellect or nous, then the word soul, individual souls, and ultimately this basic level of reality. The example that Neoplatonists or the followers of Plotinus to a large extent would use is the image of light, the sun. So things gush forth in existence out of the one, out of this most perfect or beyond perfection, the being. I don't know if it's proper to say being, the God beyond perfection. They emanate like light emanates out of the sun. And the theme, which was influential, is this scale, the natural scale, the great chain of being, which is emanating from the one. And each philosopher back then had his contribution to make to this list. But it's a dissension of being from the one towards this basic level of reality which we have. I guess these are just meant to incite some interest, and hopefully the lacunae will be filled in your respective classes. Thank you.